This is the weekly webinar that Boberdoo does, noon every Wednesday Central Time. This is our webinar that we do. Normally, the topic is a introduction to Boberdoo from the standpoint of giving information to new clients or new users. But occasionally, we'll do what we're doing today, which is to have a special topic. And this is a big one. This is in regard to the FCC rules that everyone, I'm sure, is aware of. We'll go over the basics of that, spend a few minutes on that, but mainly we want to focus on a lot of the questions that we are getting from our clients and outside of that at conversations that we have. And we've certainly noticed some very common questions, but we also wanted to have an opportunity to open it up for the attendees to ask any questions that we may not have heard yet. So with that, I think what we'll do, I think the waiting room should be empty now. Welcome those of you who just joined us. We're going to jump right in the topic here. Just as a way to just kind of summarize what we're going to do today, we're going to cover the one-to-one consent, I think is kind of the general term here in response to the FCC rules. And so we'll talk about the basics there, and then, like I said, do some questions here. We have Scott, who is going to talk about the finer details here, and so I'll just kind of walk us through the loose agenda that we have, and then any questions from the attendees, we definitely want to get into those. We certainly would encourage you to start putting your questions into the chat. We also have Taylor from Boberdoo as well. She and I will be working in the background, looking at the questions coming in at chat and looking for commonality. We may already have some of the questions in our queue that are already being asked in the chat, and so we'll kind of rectify all that. And at that, Scott, let's jump into the first slide of the deck and get going here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so obviously with the FCC, we have the disclaimer to talk about. That is from Boberdoo's standpoint, we are not attorneys. A lot of the topics here do certainly have a legal component, but we aren't here trying to give any legal advice to anyone specifically. We're simply just mainly focusing on what Boberdoo is doing in response to the rules to offer solutions to our clients and users so that they are able to pursue that almighty compliance. And so with regard to the overview, Scott, why don't you cover how this affects how our Boberdoo users are going to be approaching this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as an overview with regards to one-to-one consent, the FCC has ruled that consumers must consent to specific sellers on the form, the same page where their phone number is displayed or is inputted, and those link outs to the company walls, full lists of companies that may potentially contact the consumers going away if you are using an ATDS, an auto dialer, or a text service. So the one-to-one consent is something that will greatly affect some of our clients and really have no effect on others, because ultimately it depends on how your lead buyers, to which the FCC refers to as sellers, how they are reaching out to that consumer. So ultimately, each company needs to evaluate how one-to-one consent will impact their business. As Michael mentioned, we have a lot of clients in different verticals, so we are trying to kind of bring ideas and solutions from other verticals so that other companies can take advantage of it. And we'll talk more about like what happens if you have some clients that require it and other clients that do not. So who is affected? Shortly, everyone is affected to some degree or another. Lead generators certainly are affected. Those people that are generating the leads on our website, they have to either adjust their forms or at least adjust their flow to present the the sellers, those end companies that the consumer is going to be contacted by. Resellers, so also known as lead generation companies or aggregators, certainly will be affected. We'll get into more on that aspect of it, but ultimately you can no longer bid for the lead as a whole if you are working with your buyers that require that one-to-one consent. You will have to return a bid that is specific to each buyer that you're working with. The sellers, or as the FCC refers to it, or buyers, clients, customers, those will also be affected because they're the ones that are of increased liability when it comes to picking up or dialing that consumer, and they're going to have to change the ways that they're working with resellers and lead generators to make sure that their company name is displayed to limit their risk. And then finally, consumers. If a consumer lands on a page that is a proprietary offer, and that companies hit their budget or cannot service that lead for one reason or another, that consumer does lose out. They have to go submit their information on another form and subject themselves to a new flow. Whereas being able to dynamically insert those sellers and present them to the consumer does ultimately allow that consumer to input their information at less places and still get their needs serviced. So continuing on with kind of the defining of terms that we started here. First, dynamic consent, brand explicit consent, which sounds a little dirty. Ping, pick, post. These are just different terms for essentially the same thing, which is sending partial information, here previously known as ping, to match to different potential buyers of that lead, and then returning that company information back to the consumer and allowing them to select which companies get their information. The lead is a consumer, in most cases, sometimes a business owner in B2B leads. They're the ones that are actually filling out the form or clicking on that landing page. A seller, as the FCC defines them, are the service provider or product that is contacting the consumer. So they are the seller of the good or service, not the one that is selling the consumer's information. So there can be some confusion on there. Terminology is something that this industry has not necessarily standardized. We're going to try to be as consistent as possible in using these terms so that everybody can be on the same page. Reseller, so lead generation companies, lead aggregators, brokers are kind of all being lumped into this reseller term. They're not the ones that are actually generating the lead, and they're not the ones that are actually calling that consumer to service their request, but they are in the middle. They still hold a very valuable place. And then finally, the lead generator. That is the company that actually is running the marketing to the landing page. They own the web property on which that consumer is submitting their information.
I think in terms of the definitions and such, Scott, I think the biggest one is the term seller that the FCC uses, which is almost opposite of what our industry has always referred to as the seller. And so getting used to that takes a little bit of time, but certainly that comes into play. We have certainly some questions coming in chat. We're going to intermix some of those as some more of those come in. Let's kick off with one that does deal with kind of that terminology, Scott. So with regard to, I'm sorry, did you say something? Oh. So as a lead buyer, which the FCC calls a seller, what is the method that a company is going to be using to ensure that the leads are explicitly consented to by the consumer? What is that going to look like? And Scott, you have a model that we can show.
Sorry, Michael, could you repeat that question?
Talking about lead buyers, or as the FCC calls them, sellers, but those who are buying leads, how can a company ensure that the leads are explicitly consented to by the consumer?
Sure. So number one, I think that relationships are going to change between buyers and sellers of leads. So I think that, having a direct relationship with any reseller or lead generator that you work with is going to be more important than it might be now. From more of a technical standpoint, it looks like there are going to be those services like Journaya and Trusted Form that are going to require, or that may be required to verify that your company name is displayed in the appropriate spot for that dynamic consent. When you look at Boberdoo, our clients have been using outside services for similar things for a while, whether that is on the ping or the post. You can make those calls to third parties and then only continue on with processing of the lead, or in this case, bidding on the lead, in the cases where your company information is displayed.
The chat questions are coming in, so we're going to get to one that we have on our list, as well as coming into the chat with regard to outside opportunities with regard to the ping pick post, which is one of the terms that we hear, which is also kind of the dynamic consent. But in addition to that, with the list like you were showing, what are the other alternatives beyond just that relying on the consumer to actually pick something? What can we also do in terms of being able to maximize the potential there?
So when we look at the that process, and currently it's been simply just displaying that company information. That we look at these. This is, I'm on homemodel.net. This is just a demo site that we have for a working solution. So your traditional or typical dynamic consent, the consumer goes through, submits the ping fields, and then is presented with the potential dynamic matching companies, TCPA text, and then the rest of the form here so they can submit their information. Now, when we look at what is actually returned in the response, it's really opening up for other things beyond just that company information to be returned. So for example, in these responses here, we have the company information. We have what we would call an HTML offer. So it is essentially an open field that you can use to differentiate your sellers from each other. This can be used, this was used many years ago on confirmation pages. So in many cases, it's can throw back to the old days. But the idea here is that you can use this space to differentiate your sellers. This is something that can maybe specifically address some of the concerns about small businesses and minority-owned businesses not being represented in the selection, or brand bias, where consumers may be likely to select a better known brand. This gives you those opportunities to combat that. While we're on this page, an educated consumer is presented with a list. Another concern that we see here is, well, if it was me and I'm presented with these companies, I'm going to go and Google them or do my own research. And I'm just really using this form to get this list. And then the lead generators can't monetize that view. Boberdoo is building into this flow the ability for you to return dynamic numbers. for those companies. So you could then monetize a call going to that company, and then also clicks. So as we see here, you could charge for the click if the consumer decides to click on that website um, and do some of their own independent research. So the monetization opportunities for a lead are increased based off of that ping that's reached.
Scott, I know you touched on it briefly, but there's a couple of questions coming in. How are calls affected for the one-to-one consent? And I think also the question about SMS can kind of be lumped into that question because there's a little bit of similarity there. You want to touch on those two?
So the calls, essentially, if I'm calling this number, that is an inbound call. So it's not subjected to the one-to-one consent that submitting the data lead would be. And similar with that click opportunity as well, to monetize that click. Again, they are initiating that action and going out to that website. And then what was the second part of the question, Michael?
SMS.
So if SMS, we're talking about an outbound text to the consumer, then that is something that dynamic consent is required for, or excuse me, one-to-one consent is required for. And so this opt-in, that is where your TCPA language comes in. This is a demo site. We have a representative TCPA language, but this is where we would recommend that your in-house or your attorneys provide you with the appropriate language for that page.
You were talking about Jernaya earlier. We had a question if you could go in and do a deeper dive in terms of how that's all working. It sounds like there might be some people out there who've really not crossed paths with the Jernaya aspect of leads. And so maybe you can outline that.
So we'll kind of use this as an opportunity to jump into our lead system here, home models. And if we look at boberdoo's Form Builder, obviously there will be APIs to do all of these things that we're talking about, but boberdoo will also have a form. And so right now there are spaces for you to put third-party scripts. So as a lead generator, you put either the trusted form and or the Jernaya script onto your landing pages where the lead is generated. They capture some information when that lead is submitted and generate essentially a unique ID. That is then passed along with the rest of the lead fields. Does a couple of things. One, that information can be used to either reject or continue on with processing of a lead. For example, as it relates to originating domain or age. And then also the owner of the account can claim that certificate, and that way that is your evidence or proof that that consent was captured.
One question coming in here also, which reflects what we were hearing at the trade show recently, in terms of just the specifics of the company being displayed for the consumer to choose. I think that we're going to be hearing this for months probably, but what are the rules with regard to what is displayed? The brand name of the company that the consumer is actually going to talk to. How does that work? And I think the short answer you could go into, but there's a lot of different answers to this.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that there are, I believe, differing opinions as far as what exactly will have to be displayed. I've heard in some cases if it is just the company name, for example, Allstate, versus a franchise of a company, in which case that individual franchise must be displayed as the company contacting the consumer. I think ultimately, when we look at the people in this ecosystem, the sellers, those companies are going to have to get with their legal representation to uh, so that each company knows what they should be returning. And it does bring up another interesting point when you get into some of the more technical things, is that uh, uh, deduping comes into play when you're talking about, uh, in this case, hey, I only want to show based on my A/B testing, I only want to provide 2 companies. What happens if I have 5 companies that I could potentially display on this form? The processing logic for dynamic consent is essentially moved. To date, right now, the ping comes in, uh, assuming a best revenue scenario distribution. The bids are all calculated, but then when the post comes in, the lead is sold to whatever the best revenue scenario is at that time. Um, so essentially, after the lead is captured, this is essentially moving the um, it's essentially moving the distribution logic to all be up front before that consumer is presented with the leads. So when you look at some of the things that we're doing behind the scenes, the processing options are a big part of that. We'll actually share a different screen here. So we are working on 3 main processing logics here. You'll forgive the Excel screenshot. Processing logic is one of those things that's sometimes difficult to visualize. But in each of these next 3 use cases, the lead generators use case is basically the same. I want to display up to 5 sellers to the consumer on my lead form, and I have more than 5 sellers that I could potentially show. How does the system decide who gets selected? So when we're talking about that sorting logic, best price, it is obviously the first one that comes to mind. If you look here, the client here has essentially a direct relationship with some, and then they also have a reseller that is returning bids on behalf of their sellers. So when we look at the list, we've gotten for this particular lead a potential of 11 responses, so 11 companies. And then the system goes through and has to sort these. Oops. Has to sort these by price. So we're looking at the bid column here. We select A and B, which are direct relationships that the company has with the seller. We see the next 2 bids in terms of the price are actually returned from a reseller, but they are duplicates of companies that are already in that company's account. So the deduping is going to be something that's very important. You want a good user experience for the consumer. You want to display Allstate 3 times. There's still discussion on how this is going to be done. I know there are talk about using DUNS number to the extent that it can be used, so that there is a unique field that can be duped as opposed to just name, so that you're not subjected to Allstate versus Allstate Inc. and so on and so forth. As we continue down here, those that are in green were selected, and then we get down to the sorting. Seller L here was too low of a bid. So pretty basic use case. The top 5 bids then deduped are presented to the consumer to select. When we look at the next one, which I find really interesting, it gets to, what happens after that lead is, or after those sellers are returned to the consumer, to the lead. When we look at best expected revenue per display, we are essentially doing revenue calculations and adjusting the sorting accordingly. So again, if you want to display up to 5 sellers, you have 11 returned in the response. Would calculate the total revenue from all of the leads that resulted in that individual seller being returned, and that would be tracked both for your direct sellers and any bids received through a reseller. And then track that, say, over the last 100, last 1,000, some denominator, to calculate what the revenue per display actually is. So this would take into account the number of times that seller K was returned to the consumer and they were not selected. It would also take into account the number of times that K was returned to the consumer selected K, and K did not buy that lead or refunded it. So in the case of post rejects or partners with high refund rates, that would adjust the sorting because they would be looking at less revenue as the numerator there. So when we go through that sorting logic, we see versus the previous one that this seller O had fallen off of this list because they post rejected a lot of leads. And so that even though seller B or seller L might have a lower overall bid, the expected earnings are greater, and so they're sorted above. And then the last one that we're working on here is weighted logic. So this is a form of priority distribution. If you can imagine, you have an anchor client or a client that you want to make sure you're getting volume to. You want to make sure that their information is returned to the consumer to be selected many times or a certain number of times per day. The weighted logic allows you to do that by setting daily targets, and then we calculate the distribution percentage. So in this example, we are ignoring price, and we are only looking at how many leads that individual seller has received today versus what their daily target is. And then we will sort and distribute or present these sellers with the 5 lowest distribution percentages. So if price is less of a concern, the weighted logic would be a good option there. And just as a little aside, these are all variations of existing logics that we have in the system now. Just more your current logic, best revenue, presumably isn't working for you, you see some holes, we can certainly explore other ones.
I would imagine those screens, Scott, are going to be the most screenshot captures of this whole presentation right there. Everyone's probably grabbing that.
Yeah, and our team's working on some better infographics than certainly that I can produce here that'll illustrate those flows.
Well, those certainly illustrate a lot there. Okay, questions are really stacking up here. Let's see if we can kind of combine some here, kind of in the form of a yes/no here. Talking about exclusive leads and what needs to be displayed when it's an exclusive lead situation. I think I know the answer to this, but the question is can they, in an exclusive situation, just simply put the client name in the TCPA disclaimer as opposed to actually having a checkbox for that potential buyer? And I think it's door number 2. They still have to click the box.
No, actually, in an exclusive match, you can just present that individual company. So if you looked at our first example here, there are more than one potential matches, but as you mentioned, not everybody deals with non-exclusive leads. Some people deal only in exclusive leads, but still would have different partners and don't want to necessarily build proprietary campaigns just for one client, be subjected to the whims of that demand. So if we go to our dynamic consent exclusive match option, so this is something that would be returned in the response if you're using the APIs, but built right into the logic of the boberdoo form builder. So the first part is essentially the exact same. I'm submitting my ping information. The difference here is that this is an exclusive match. So there are not individual companies called out here. We have magic strings that will be able to utilize to display the company name, company website, company phone number, and so that you can embed those directly in the TCPA terms. And that way it is just the single select to consent to the flow as a whole. But you do not have to then have a separate checkbox that specifically separates out roofer Roofington in this case for the submit. And then again, if you're dealing in both scenarios, an exclusive and non-exclusive, the Boberdoo form builder will be dynamic. So it would include this response if it's a match, and then the list of companies with the check boxes in a non-exclusive match.
Okay, one question that is getting a couple of thumbs up even, and there's even a secondary question that somebody else asked that's similar. It's all going into the reseller conversation, the network of and pings and such, and what needs to be displayed. So I'll read one of the questions. I think that captures it pretty well. If we ping a network buyer and the network returns an end buyer name, which is different than the name of the network, will the ping reply back to our website and be able to show the end buyer's name and not the network's name? And you're nodding, so I'll let you take it away.
Exactly. It's going to do you no good to be able to display the network's name, right? You're going to need to display the end seller. So if you look at just our non-exclusive one here, this is where if we fix it, for example, was returned by the network as their end buyer, this will be displayed accordingly. So it would only be in the lead system itself where there would be the documentation or the logging that network one was the one that bought the lead, and they bought it on behalf of or sold it to, in this case, We Fix Anything. If we take a look, I'm going to show one part of our specs here.
And while you're doing that, Scott, the checkboxes cannot be pre-populated with a checkbox. It has to be done by the consumer, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, virtually everybody I've talked to has asked that question. We wish, that was the case, but I think the idea is that it does have to be explicit consent, so action has to be taken. So if you bear with me here, I'll pull this up.
That last question about the checkbox received a thumbs down, by the way, from the crowd.
Yeah, right.
Coliseum in here.
It does bring an interesting, point to the lead generators, the marketers. One, I would certainly encourage testing the effect of displaying multiple companies. I think that is going to be very vertical specific. I think there will be some verticals that it actually improves and revenue may go up, whereas others, people are only interested in one. That's where, each company and your marketing is going to be different. And, starting that so that when this rolls around, you don't have to start the A/B testing then or be behind the eight ball. So I'm going to show our multiple bid example here for this is now looking at the API specs for dynamic consent. The idea is that network essentially would return to you, the lead generator, this response that includes the total number of bids and then a specific bid ID for each of those sellers that they are returning in the response. And so that way, when the lead comes in and is selected a seller, let's say they select this particular seller here, the transaction would be associated with the network, and they would know that, Brand Roofing Co. in this case was selected by the consumer, and they should route it accordingly. So all of that will have to get passed through in the response. And that kind of goes to organization and labeling. So when we look at the partners in Boberdoo, we're just for illustration purposes showing this with the existing labeling, but we will have new labels related to one-to-one consent and seller resellers so that you can label your partners accordingly. So whether they're a reseller and whether or not they require one-to-one consent. Those resellers are the ones where the deliveries will be set up to look in there and log those transactions accordingly.
I think this is a question that's a follow-up to when you were talking, and I think you had a slide that was showing the expected earnings, or at least that was a portion of the slide. Adam, you'll have to forgive me if I don't capture the essence of this question, but I'll just read it as is. Would you have to return the net dollars for each lead in order for Boberdoo to know the expected earnings? And I think that that's kind of on a technical level, I'm guessing, with returns of responses and what's being sent. Does that make sense, Scott?
Yeah, so in my example, for the expected revenue per display, that was with the assumption that you're doing that through Boberdoo. There may be other cases where there's other systems, but all of that revenue is tracked in Boberdoo. So all of the data is in there for you to run those calculations. And that's whether or not it is a direct seller or a reseller. Because at the end of the day, when we log the reseller transaction, it will have specified their subseller that they ended up routing that lead to, and then ultimately the revenue tracked through that.
Okay. Next one, asking about post rejects and how that's going to be handled. And I think this was on our list to talk about anyway. So thanks, TJ, for jumping in with that one and teeing that one up. Scott, so how do we deal with the post rejects when it tries to post and then you got to get that consent from the buyer for the new alternative?
So that comes to, thank you page management. And then another thing that we're working on that we're calling the dynamic consent widget. So, one, when you're looking at post rejects, there's two reasons why a lead is post rejected. One is because it fails the lead scoring or outside services lookup in our case. And then two is when the selected partner rejects that lead. So in the first case, there's the opportunity to essentially bring that consumer back to, make sure I have the right one, back to this page and either exclude the one that was selected and only show the remaining ones, or to generate a new list of partners. In the Boberdoo form builder, there's going to be separate sections for how to handle each of those outcomes. Right now, there is just one generic thank you page for everything, but we will have unmatched, exclusive matched, semi-exclusive matched as ways that you can determine what to do in those situations. So one of those essentially is another monetization. So let's say a lead comes in and your only buyer post rejects that lead. You could then maybe redirect that lead to a click offer to try and monetize it as an example. The other one that we have would kind of kill two birds with one stone, our dynamic consent widget. So a lot of people have said, I'm not changing my form, or really don't want to change my form, we are working on essentially a widget that you would place on your thank you page. So that way you do not have to adjust your form at all. Person can still go through, submit it just as it is right now. Then when the lead is submitted on the thank you page, this would be the JavaScript to display your TCPA text and then the dynamic matching partners to that particular lead. So this gives you some advantages here. Number one, you already have captured that lead, so I can come back to what you can do with it. You can, essentially send new pings in to refresh this list and get new buyers. So when you're looking at it, maybe from your own forms, that carousel of more partners to display to the consumer so that they can get their needs or their quote or whatever that is. And then, the marketing around incentivizing the consumer or convincing the consumer of selecting multiple. Those that select multiple seller companies, ultimately save 10% or get their project completed the due date 20% faster. But ultimately, the consumer's phone number then is a magic string returned in the TCPA text. You already have all the rest of that information, and then they can select whichever ones they want. Now, this probably brings up to people that are marketers. Well, that's probably a good opportunity for me to remarket that consumer back to this page down the road, which is certainly a possibility to generate a new ping and a potential new set of matching partners. Now, the other thing I want to touch on for this is, again, the important part here is that the entire lead was captured already. So that lead is sitting in home model, fingers crossed, if it wasn't a duplicate. And so the question is right now, if it's sitting in a review status because the consumer has not selected specific companies yet. So what happens if the consumer X's out of the browser or doesn't do anything? That is where the one-to-one consent labeling comes into play. We are working on reprocessing options so that at the end of expiration time, the lead can be automatically reprocessed to only partners that do not require your one-to-one consent. And so obviously you're still going to need your TCPA language on your forms themselves, but if you are dealing with buyers that require consent and others that don't, you can set it up and still monetize those leads that the consumer has not yet selected a specific company.
Okay, I think that was an explanation that may have covered some of the questions that came in while you
Might
were
have covered
talking.
a couple of them on there.
Yeah. So, question: do they need to resubmit their PII? I think you did answer that. That it's captured and it's being.
Exactly. That's in the lead system. It's associated with this, and that's again using that JavaScript widget.
Okay.
They would not have to resubmit their information since it's already.
And then the follow-up to that question was, or could we ask them, are you interested in XYZ categories, and then show the offers?
Well, I have to lean on Michael's original disclaimer for that question. I can tell you that the hesitation was because The seller list has to be topically and logically related. And so this list of sellers would still need to be specific to roofers if this was a roofing landing page, for example. But this is the thank you page, and there are probably other places that you could, advertise through a banner ad or some other click. People that while you're waiting for your roofing, your roofing quotes, get a quote on cash out refi or something like that. But from a marketer standpoint, I would assume that your best monetization opportunity is to target your marketing around getting them to select multiple companies.
Okay. And then I think another question that was kind of as a follow-up, Taylor saying, so having the TCPA only on the thank you page is still compliant. I think that's correct.
This TCPA text, yeah, in this flow, you most likely would have like a different you would most likely have a different TCPA text on your form. Whatever's currently there, probably less the seller list. But you would still want whatever language that you have on there for the form, the form itself.
And then the natural follow-up with that line of thought, is if the lead bounces off the page on the thank you page, but already submitted their, I think it's the PII info, can we reach out to them directly to try to save the lead? I think I know the answer to that, but I'll let you take it.
I don't know, actually. I mean, I think there's still a lot of that. I
think that falls into the category of err on the side of caution and probably not contact them.
Well, I mean, I think it ultimately depends on what that language, the text that you have on your first page of your form is, right? Presumably now yours says something along the lines of home model and its affiliates or marketing partners may contact you even if you're on the DNC. You would want something similar on that form that like you have now, so that you could contact them.
Okay. Let's see here. Kind of a new line of thought here. So I think this question just confirming what we were talking about. So isn't it set up where all buyers need consent? The way I interpret that is that yes, that each of the buyers displayed need to have a checkbox done by the consumer, I think is the way I'm seeing that question.
So leads have always had to provide consent. The question of whether or not they need to provide one-to-one consent to the end seller that is contacting them, Rooferton Roofing in this case, is dependent upon Roofington's what they're going to do with that lead. If they are using an auto dialer or text service, then their company information has to be displayed and the consumer has to explicitly select it. If they are not, presumably that explicit checkbox is not required. Although from what we've been hearing, that you have to prove that you're not using an auto dialer or text service if in a TCPA complaint. So the risk for the seller that is calling the consumer in a not using an auto dialer or text service, the burden of proof is on them to prove they're not using them. So, in my personal eyes, that is still some expense that you're going to be spending on legal, whether it is settling a litigator claim or paying a defense attorney in the case of it. But that's a decision that each seller company can make themselves.
So talk a little bit about the difference between the consent page, I guess you could say, and then what can be displayed on the thank you page. Because the question coming in, is it okay, I guess is with the nature of the question, that on the thank you page to offer additional partners for them to agree to after they've already agreed to one or more partners in the previous panel? Can you display additional ones?
Presumably, I mean, the one-to-one consent of FCC did not comment on a number of times or anything like that. Is that the seller has to be, explicitly selected by the consumer. So that's where I mentioned like the idea of a carousel. You go through, you select two of these, hit I agree, and then this rotates through with another set of three potential sellers, and they can do a I'm complete. Those are all essentially just API calls back and forth. While the ping post to date has been primarily ping, bid, post the lead, and that's it. This does, I think, it provides some incentive to evolve that flow so that there is more back and forth information pass.
Mm-hmm. Question about the dynamic consent widget example. When they check the individual buyer names, is the checking and unchecking of the box sending info to Boberdoo? They're noting that they don't see a submit button on that page, and they're wondering if that's happening in the background.
No, there would be a submit button on this page, replacing this here. That is a little error in our widget page here. So it would look like essentially like you're seeing here with the I agree submit button at the bottom. As a little note, we are removing the previous, this is our old forms. We have a new one rolling out here in the next week. And that actually addresses one of the other concerns of people, which is ping time. Because to go from here, the ping is presumably comes into Boberdoo and has to be processed. Boberdoo processes pings in about less than 5 milliseconds, but if you are pinging out to dynamic buyers, that is oftentimes where that lag comes into play. So going back to relationships, both the sellers having a more intimate relationship with the resellers and lead generators. I think the flip side of that is also true, because if you're a lead generator, you're going to want to control and set some pretty strict ping timeouts, and that has a byproduct of limiting the number of pings in that ecosystem that person would send out, since they're going to want to get that response back to you in a much faster time than they may need to now. But for the Boberdoo forms, obviously, if you're using APIs, that's just APIs back and forth. But the Boberdoo form is changing, so rather than loading the whole form up front as it did now, it will load the piece by piece, and you will be able to essentially set you'll be able to set in the form builder the ping stage, so where that ping when that ping gets sent, and then also where that offer list resides. So those will all be available to be adjusted on your form.
The rules with regard to the checkboxes, that applies to regardless of who owns the domain that it is capturing the lead. The question comes in, if the seller owns the domain they are on, does there need to be a checkbox at all? Interesting view on that, and I think the next question leads right into that.
Is the one that's calling the lead. presumably then you still need to have your TCPA text, but it could be more where the company information is just part of the text as opposed to being separately called out. And so that is where, when you look at monetizing a consumer, the lead generators are going to want to not just necessarily return a company name, but also a phone number so that the consumer can initiate a call to that company. And then to answer what I think that question was if I'm selling clicks, I'm a lead generator and selling clicks to Gray's Roofing, and the consumer clicks to Gray's Roofing, they are on that company's landing page. In this case, the seller, Gray Roofing, owns the website and is going to be the one that's contacting them.
Okay. And then take that explanation and let's talk about it in the world of insurance. Can the seller listed be a carrier and the lead be sold to any agent within the carrier? Or does it need to be the agent's name and that specific agent number? This is one we've heard a few times.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they've specifically identified what exactly needs to be there. I've heard it's just the company name, in which case it would be Allstate or Allstate Holdings, whatever that official company name is. But like I mentioned before, in the case of a franchise, Keller Williams Real Estate, or a home improvement gutter company or something like that, I believe it would be the end franchise, the individual franchisee, that would have to be listed.
Okay. We are at our 2-minute warning here. Tons of questions still. One of the things I'm going to do just for the audience here is I'm going to capture all the questions we did not get to, and we're going to keep a list because I predict we will be doing more of these webinars as follow-ups as more is known and we develop more solutions and such. But Scott, 2 minutes remaining. How you want to wrap this up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as you mentioned, Michael, next week we have a webinar on live transfers and how to handle those in the boberdoo system, posting both the data and the call through one lead type. But as far as the next upcoming ones, we are going to be continuing this series on dynamic consent. Our next one up, I think we're calling a live audible right now, and we'll basically take all the questions that we didn't get to today and continue on this with that next webinar. So we can do another hour of questions and things that we're hearing, and then continue on with more solutions-based webinars after that to dig into the details on processing and APIs and the form builder. We do have more advanced ping post webinar that's going to be hosted by Brett here coming up. And then Dan is going to be doing a webinar on Know Your Customer Laws, vetting your partners and vendors. I hope one takeaway that you did have from here is that your relationship with your buyers and sellers most likely will have to change, either coming in demand from the lead buyers that are going to have different requirements as far as liabilities it relates to displaying their company information, and then also from the sellers and resellers, understanding, if your buyer says they don't need one-to-one consent, is that a risk that you're willing to take? Is there some vetting that you would want to do to ensure that they aren't just loading them into an auto dial? Finishing up here, I would say, I know there's open call for FCC comment. We would encourage you to do so. And I know there's been a lot of posts and suggestions in the industry on LinkedIn and all the socials. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let us know. And then finally, if you want to set up a one-on-one call to talk about your specific business with myself, Michael, or anybody else at Boberdoo, just shoot us an email and we can get something on the books.
All right. I think we have met our time limit here. I hear people are dropping off, but thanks, Scott, and everyone else for joining. And watch your inboxes for additional announcements of more topics coming up. I think that this was hopefully helpful for everyone. Other than that,
thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Have a great